Donc en fait, c'est dans le contexte géographique.
Right, we will continue the general geographical
La civilisation,
and historical context started last week, talking about the Oxus civilization between the 3rd and 2nd millennium
cette fois-ci, un peu la continuité.
BC. And today we'll just continue to present the following works, and we want to talk again about urbanizations in Central Asia.
Durant cette période,
Just to remind you, during this period of time, we found some urban complex elements, manor houses, temples,
avec des quartiers d'habitation,
housing districts, storing units,
des palais,
palaces.
avec une distribution interne
Usually they have these
liée entre
districts which are connected with one another with long corridors. And also we've got whole cities which are fortified with city walls, ramparts.
Zarkutan,
In Jakarta, the site that we partly mentioned last week, we've been working there since 2007. And
cette ville, en fait, on voit
in this city side,
rempart,
we can see two ramparts. The first one in the north,
la citadelle,
including a citadel
ses places et ses quartiers.
with a square and palace and
Un deuxième rempart
housing districts. And there's a second city wall here,
qui aurait
or rampart, which we can see a few badly preserved elements. And maybe this wall would have included all the lower city, including the temple.
en 2011, c'est sur
In 2011,
peu exploré ou fouillé,
these different areas were not very much excavated, so we started a magnetic prospection thanks to experts from the city of Lyon.
particulièrement étudié,
There were several areas that were studied in that way, especially the vacant, empty space of the so-called citadel area north of the site here,
mais c'est également au fait la partie
and also the central part
autour du temple,
around the temple
toute cette partie centrale,
here,
et une
as you
troisième
see, and a third
qui comprend
prospection area, including the necropolis area, so-called necropolis area, in the southern part of the site.
nos résultats dans la citadelle montrent tout de suite en fait
The findings in the citadel showed several
ici dans le
positive abnormalities, that is to say, what we see here in black.
construction des cartes magnétiques avec nos
We superimposed the magnetic maps and the
ciel
excavation maps, and former excavation maps as well. And so, all in all, we can find a complex series
de droite, donc toute la partie
of elements. In red, as you can see on the right side here, red and blue structures were excavated by us and our colleagues from Uzbekistan. And in yellow, this is the interpretations we were able to do thanks to the magnetic prospection studies.
plus ou moins après sondage. Donc on a
And after the different probings, we were able to assess the presence of all these elements on the site.
nous voyons en fait donc dans ces trois couleurs un ensemble.
Including all the three colors, we can see an area
Nous voyons également
dedicated mostly to the Bronze Age era.
Lhuillier, nous voyons aussi en fait
But Johanna Lhuillier, my colleague, will talk to you also later on about large pits
un peu tout autour des structures
that appear all around the structures, inside the structures
de l'âge du bronze.
of this Bronze Age city.
En fait à ce que France nous a dit en fait,
And
les huttes
Franz Grenet said something about the semi-buried huts, and I can tell you that in the beginning I didn't really believe in that when I would read the Soviet publications, but then after what we found, as a matter of fact, these light huts existed, and some people certainly occupied the citadel during the Iron Age period, and there were certainly some rooms that were elevated or high, but in a diachronical way, we can see that it was also all around the city, and it lasted about 500 years. We've got carbon-14 more or less precise datings between 1,300 and 900 BC. So some colleagues found some early Iron Age ceramics, and Joanna will talk about this kind of ceramics, painted ceramic. Our colleagues used to talk about these occupiers with a few so-called garbage pits. But when we look at the pits in a closer way, because it's all really on the surface of the site, so the latest occupation of the site, but we'll see later that these pits are more complex and they include more structures. About the central part of the Jakartan site, we have about the same observations. It was certainly very much deteriorated, and on the left we see the structures, but then we on the right-hand side superimpose everything we found between the probing, the excavations, and magnetic prospection, and we see the complexity of urban network. And there was the main urban axis, an avenue in green here, that would cut the site into two parts centrally. Temple here in center, right-hand side. A temple was certainly not isolated from the rest at the time. We have a general overview of the site, and you should imagine that the western part was also occupied. All of this was destroyed because of agricultural fields, but that is why our colleagues in the 70s, when the site was discovered, said that the site was actually 10 hectares large. More to the south of the site, we have a tiny river, which is also sort of division of the site. In the south, where probably the necropolis was, we discovered two very different areas. One which is without any structure. We can still see a few pits. In that case, there were pits including graves, and more to the south, the necropolis was more inhabited with corpses, if so to speak. So in the entire southern part, we have found 2,500 or even up to 3,000 graves. I wanted to talk longer about this part of the necropolis as well, because we can also talk about mortuary or funerary urbanism in that case. There were many sepulchral pits, and as you see on the map, you also had looters' pits and contemporary pits later on in this necropolis area. So a very dense kind of occupation of this part of the necropolis. According to our calculations, there were about 5,000 to 6,000 people during one millennium, people who did not just come from the proto-city of Jakarta itself only, but dead bodies that also came from all around the site, from the valleys and mountains, because as far as we know today, in the mountain sites, there wasn't any necropolis. So all the dead people were welcome in this large necropolis of Jakarta. If you look closer, these graves are very deep, to 2.5 meters deep. And also in between the graves and inside the graves, there are many rituals connected to fire. You have stone layouts. You had animal pits. I mean, they are empty pits. In many cases, we call them cenotaphs, but I don't think this was the case. You also had ceramic pits, ceramic deposits. Specificity of this kind of ceramics, they are late kind of ceramics, and we didn't find many burial places, in fact, in this necropolis. So this transition between Bronze Age and Iron Age in Central Asia, well, this necropolis would be just a few kilometers south of the current site of Jakarta. Another interesting thing is we see some low walls just on the surface of the ground. They're here in green. We try to draw them everywhere. And in this mortuary urban layout, there were a few elements to tell about the locations of graves or group of people. Once again, the alignment of the site is more southeast to northwest, a bit like the urban layout. And the low walls allowed people to circulate, to not lose their tracks, a bit like today in Necropolis. Just to say as well that, unfortunately, in most cases, the graves were looted. Out of 5, maybe 3 of them are systematically looted. There were some rich materials: bronze, bone, stone, and mostly ceramic objects. The ceramics could be placed around bodies, and there were some important items, up to 40 items in one grave. So this part was to finish the first presentation from last week, and now we are in a transition period between Bronze Age and Iron Age, and the works have been carried out for 12 years, since 2001, from Lhuillier in Turkmenistan and Jakarta in Uzbekistan. So all these findings allowed us to have a clear idea of this badly known period, which is the Iron Age, and Joanna Lhuillier will talk to you about Iron Age. Right. After the Oxus civilization of the Bronze Age that was presented to you last week and today, the Iron Age period is between 1500 and 1000 BC, more or less. For a long time, it was considered as a deterioration period, material, economic, social, and cultural deterioration. And indeed, what Julio Bendezu-Sarmiento presented to you last week disappeared. Long-distance exchanges stopped. The artistic production disappeared. It was replaced, by utilitarian artifacts, as you see on the left-hand side here, tools and weapons, mostly made of stone and bronze. Ceramics is also quite striking. And it underlines this transformation. Instead of being lathed and standardized during the Bronze Age, it becomes cast and painted during the Iron Age. And this material transformation is also assisted by cultural and religious transformations. And we can see that mostly because of the disappearance of burials and inhumations. From that time, bodies were exposed to the open air for the flesh to be removed, and this will lead to Mazdaism later on. And the reasons for this change are not very clear, but it's one of the main issues at stake to understand Central Asian proto-history. Apparently, this was a combination of reasons. During late Bronze Age, the Oxus civilization became weaker for several reasons, which we're not going to present today, and the contacts with the steppe populations had intensified, and the disappearance of a strong power from the Oxus civilization led to the fragmentation of power into smaller entities. One of the direct consequences of that is that the population were fragmented. The proto-urban cities of Bronze Age with palaces and temples were replaced by small villages. People would still live in the same regions in an oasis system, that is, a group sites in irrigated areas. You can see an example here with some villages grouped in a large territory, and sometimes you have one central site, like Yazdepe here, which you see. For certain reasons, in historical researches, the Iron Age is sort of the poor parent of Central Asian archaeology, as Franz Gröner said last week, and so very few villages of that period of time are well known. But in the last years, 2 French missions worked on some of these villages. The first site is Koktepe in Sogdia. It was excavated by Mohammad Jami Isaimindinov and Claude Rapin. And I'm not going to talk about this site today. And the second site is Jakutan in Bactria. So it was presented to you by Bendezu-Sarmiento, also excavated by Samidi Mustafa Kulov. And it was presented to you for Bronze Age period. It's important also for the early Iron Age period because it's one of the few Central Asian sites that was occupied during the Bronze Age up to the early Iron Age. So we can look at the transition there, whereas the other sites were newly founded during the Iron Age, and it's also a site which was neglected at the end of the Iron Age, so it makes things more visible to us. Compared to the Bronze Age, the occupied area is much smaller. It's just reduced to the citadel in the north of the site here, which is the upper area of the Bronze Age period. And the reasons for this site to be occupied is only due to the enclosure wall or surrounding wall from the Bronze Age, which was certainly used during the Iron Age period, as well as the excavation showed. These are the details of the excavation site. It shows that the area was occupied during the Iron Age, even a bit more as well to the south. So in all, it covered a 2-hectare area. It might seem small, but it's the first time that a village of this period is excavated, such a large village. So we have identified a typical habitat of the time, the semi-buried huts mostly. That is to say, cabins in which foundation are dug into the ground, and the facades, the walls were made of cob. So it's not troglodyte, as you'll see. The cabins and the pits that we discovered comply with a certain organization plan, which meant that some Bronze Age structures were reused. Now let me show you again this map. See that within the Bronze Age structures, with all these walls aligned, all the oval-shaped structures that you see are Iron Age housings that were put in the corridors of the Bronze Age period in order to be protected against bad weather. The huts are of several shapes. It can be rectangular, like here, and usually they are surrounded by post holes, as you see here, and at the bottom as well. They are not very deep, usually 30 centimeters deep into the ground, so people did not live underground. We also have oval-shaped huts with a hearth in the center. You see that in the two pictures, and sometimes also silos. In other cases, as you can see in the bottom picture, the hearth were against the wall but still inside the huts. It's usually 2 to 3 meters long for 2 meters large. And their walls can be made of bricks or clay coating. In most cases, the huts are grouped with one another and they are separated by low walls that were used as limitations, but also as supporting structures and weather protections. There is another type of hut which is more scarce. So you have two circular huts related or connected with a passageway, and the central post will hold the roof. And this case here is specifically interesting. It seems to have come later. You see the red arrows show you a ground trace of a wall of a storing unit from the Bronze Age, and this wall was still raised during the Iron Age. And so we understand that there was a second phase that happened during early Iron Age. In the huts and all around, we were able to uncover different things, especially pebble passageways, and this was to circulate, but also to have the rainwater evacuated. Other structures are harder to interpret, however. We have dense accumulations either on the surface or in the pits of ceramics, portherds, and broken grinding materials and river pebbles. This feeling is really atypical, and we haven't found anything similar on contemporary sites. So we don't know what they were used for, but we thought that the pebbles were brought on purpose onto the site, so we weighted them, and every structure includes between 1 to 200 kilos of pebbles, and so this must have been on purpose. Some of them were thermofracted, and the earth in this content includes some water infiltration, so these structures were left in the open air. So because of all this, we think that all of this was used for either heating or cooking. But we don't know yet. There are other pits which functions are clearer. You see two of them here, actually, one on the edge. They are pits to receive litter and garbage in a non-occupied area of the site, just on the edge of the housing district. And the food were stored in silos, either quadrangular or circular, and usually surrounded by bricks. You can see in those pictures the bricks that were collapsed into the silos, and sometimes we found some fragmented jars in the silos. Still during the early Iron Age period, some of the silos were transformed into graves. We've got human bones here in this pit. You have long bones, vertebrae, or mandibles, and they usually belong to adults. As of now, we can't say whether the bones were thrown away in these pits with other garbage or if they were placed here on purpose. In Central Asia, the first ossuaries only appeared in the 4th century BC, that is to say 1 century later, and we don't know which were the kind of statues for human bones during that period of time. There's one specific case, this 8-shaped hut. In the very center of that, under the post hole, we found a pit with human bones, and so we think there was a specific memorial link between the deceased who were there and the living people who would live in the hut. And we also had grave tombs with several people. In one of them, we had 2 adults, 1 sub-adult, and 1 immature, 3 to 4-year-old. The taphonomic studies showed that these individuals were put there before the decay was over. We can see here the brain, the skull, and the face of one person, and the bones of the other people were placed on top of the first person, and all of the bones were handled in a way. So we think that these bones would start to fossilize under the sun rays somewhere else and were deposited somewhere else, we don't know where, and then afterwards they were put in this pit. And in the other grave we had 8 adults, 8 individuals, adults and children and immatures. It is hard to interpret all of these graves, but there must have been a specific link between these burial places and the silos that were neglected and then reused. So maybe this is linked to a belief of protected powers of ancestors for harvests, but this is still something we need to look further. On contemporary sites, there is the same, another kind of architecture which exists. We call them citadels, and they exist in south of Uzbekistan, north of Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan. The term citadel is the one used in Soviet literature, and we used it afterwards, but it's not really appropriate because their defensive functions was not confirmed. They're always placed in the same way. They are erected on a damped earth platform of 2-3 meters, and these so-called citadels seem to be very large for the early Iron Age, but they are 2 or 3 times smaller than the monuments of the Bronze Age period. So only 3 citadels were excavated: Küçük Tepe in Uzbekistan, Lhuillier J in Afghanistan, and Yaztepe in Turkmenistan. In Yaztepe, the damped earth platform that you see on the top right-hand corner is 8 meters wide, and some platforms would go up to 12 meters. On this platform, a 12-room building was built, but it wasn't totally excavated, so we don't know the exact surface area. There were 2 successive architectural phases. Firstly, it was made of 3 or 4 oblong rooms that you can still see, and it all opens to the northwest side onto a yard. And then these rooms were filled or transformed into passageways, maybe to facilitate an extra floor construction. And the main room was divided by 2, and the other part was separated into different rooms. The ceramics we found on the ground showed that during the second phase, this was certainly a military garrison habitat, because we found some clay bullets and sling bullets. For the first phase, Vadim Masson thinks that the protruding circular line meant that this wasn't a habitat but a temple or a palace. In Küçük Tepe, the platform is smaller, it's 4 meters wide, but as from the first occupation period, the building was surrounded by a wall on the northwest and south, and on the east there is an empty space. There were 4 architectural phases for this building. At first, it was a humble building, only 60 square meters with 4 rooms, and the entrance was on the east or eastward. And during the second phase, a new wall enlarged the enclosure, and in the end, this is a 6-room, 90 square meter building. During the third phase, the citadel is enlarged towards the east and southeast, thanks to the surrounding wall, and it's a 125 square meter building, and the surrounding wall is more than 1 meter large, and inside the building you've got seats and buttresses. During the last 4th phase, only part of the external walls were kept, and the building was increased again up to a surface area of 250 square meters with 23 rooms. During the 3rd and 4th phases, one of the northeast rooms, which is circled on the 2 maps, was rearranged in a different way. The walls were coated several times, so they look glossy, and there's a niche of 50 centimeter on the side and a hearth. For the archaeologists, Skarenborg and Album, the niche and the hearth meant that this was a domestic worshipping room, and for them, the citadel had different functions over time. First of all, it must have been the leaders, the clan leaders' home, and then it became a war and administrative center. As from the second period, it also became a worshipping center until the end. In Lhuillier Tepe, the dammed earth platform is built on a natural alluvial hillock 2 meters high, and it's a 6 meter wide platform. The building on top of it is the largest we know for that period. It's 28 meters from east to west and 36 from north to south. The angles have 4.5 to 6 meters wide circle towers, and the main entrance is in the north. There were also several construction phases in that case. At first, there was one large room surrounded by a corridor all around and a defensive tower. During the second phase, this room was enlarged and 2 entrances were included, and there is the cross-shaped construction which was interpreted by Victor Sayonidi as a hostel. And during the third phase, the ground level was raised and the layout was changed. The hostel was destroyed, and the interior wall was placed towards the north. And in the 4th phase, the layout is not identical anymore. The large room is now divided into 15 rooms by including several walls, and it is much deteriorated. One of the towers is raised to the ground. For Victor Sayonidi, the defensive function was only true during the first period, and as from the second period, there was a fire worshipping ritual. And then the space was divided, and if we look at the quality of construction, it must have changed during the Achaemenid period. We can see here a reconstruction of the citadel and also the excavation site. You can see how high the walls still are. In ancient Distan, in Turkmenistan, next to the Caspian Seas, we also know several citadels, and they are sometimes on a platform, rectangular or polygonal platforms, but not always. Just like here in Göbekli Tepe, this was excavated by Olivier Lecomte. The only certainty we have about these citadels is that they were to be seen from far away. The platform has no defensive function, and this impression is reinforced when we have natural alluvial hillocks, or when some ancient monuments were reused to put the buildings on top of them. There must have been an elite in this area that would control the agrarian and pastoral activities, and in ancient tea stands, for instance, there was a very complex, large canal systems. Farming would have been impossible without any irrigation system. So this was a desire to take ownership of a hostile region. 3 of the citadels are just separated by 3 kilometers. So we think there wasn't any centralized power, but it must have been an element of a non-centralized power with a tribe confederation. The social political organization was based on the common management of canals. So there must have been a flexible hierarchy and a collective territory management. During the Middle Iron Age, there is a kind of urban renaissance and the development of large, several-hectare fortified sites and fortresses, citadels, which were either circular or squared. And the period I'm mentioning is between 1000 or 900 and 540 BC, the start of the Achaemenid period. Just like for the early Iron Age period, our knowledge of this next period are very fragmentary. Ulugh-Depe is the most complete city that we excavated for that period, and it's 175 kilometers east to Ashgabat, the capital city of Turkmenistan, in the eastern part of Kopetdag Mountains. It's 13 hectares, 30 meters up according to the surrounding plain. It was occupied during the Chalcolithic period up until the late Neolithic period. So it's the longest period of time we can study for the Middle Iron Age. It was excavated by Victor Sayinedi in the 60s for the first time, and he identified the several occupation phases. And since 2001, Lhuillier J had restarted the excavations, and Julio Bendezu as well. One of the main discoveries of the French mission was to discover an urban site of a Middle Iron Age between 1100 and 1000 or 800 BC, and this is due to carbon-14 dating. It was studied in 2 different ways: excavation and also magnetic prospection, as in Jarkutan. We look at the variations of the magnetic fields, and thanks to all of this, we understand that the city would include all the site, and there were 2 parts separated by a main street that you see in yellow here. There was a upper city with large monuments and low city for housings, and all of this was included in a surrounding wall in blue here, and it covers an area of 5 hectares. This is the map of the city as it was reproduced thanks to our magnetic prospection studies and excavation studies. And we can see that there is a 3-part building, which is either called treasury or warehouse. There's another building which is supposedly a palace complex, and a last one which is a citadel. The main structure being the citadel, as you see here in the picture, it is located on the highest point of the site and overlooks the surrounding plains, and it is totally excavated now. The citadel, as the other ones that we talked about before, was built on a platform, which was certainly a 2-step platform, so it made it more vertical. The citadel is square, is made of a square plan of 40 meters side, and during the excavation period, the walls were still 1 to 3 meters high. So what you see here was partly restored, but it's also the height of the walls that we uncovered. The external walls showed different riddance, which were red and white, red for the protruding parts. And we only have the ground floor, but there was another floor because we found a straightforward massive staircase. The external wall was pierced with loopholes, fake loopholes, in order to lit the building. There was no external splaying structure, so there was no defensive role for these loopholes. There's a powerful corridor on the ground with also pebbles and coated with clay. And this corridor would access 3 areas of storing rooms. The access to all these storing units were protected by hermetically sealed doors with seals and seal impressions. And the storing units made of long and narrow rooms. Inside the rooms you had seats on which you had terracotta containers. Each room would include a large jar buried in the ground and coming on a surface facing the door. The jars were sometimes sealed as well, and we found many impressions, maybe picked up in a basket, and it was next to the southwest storing area. A circular seal was found in the filling of one of the fake loopholes of the peripheral corridor. All of these elements tend to show the essential economic role played by the citadel. It's very precise management of all the goods included in the storing units. And when we studied the seals, we understood that several civil servants would share the administration of the storage units, and the lack of scriptures that will only appear during the Achaemenid period in the region did not mean that there wasn't any strict management of local artifacts. And a fire burst out in the 2nd century, in the 9th century BC, but it was then reoccupied until the 7th century. In the next phases, there were important locking or sealing rituals. Each communication door was blocked with damped earth fillings, and the external faces or external facades were coated. You can see the blocking feeling, and you see what it looks like after being restored. In the filling of one of these passageways in between 2 storage units, we found a stork with open wings. We can see here at the bottom. Underneath, on a brick base, there were 2 fox skulls, just like the stork was all drowned into the blocking structure. And in other doors or openings, we found some seal impressions, maybe to identify the people in charge of physically and symbolically closing the building at the end of its existence. And the building, which some administrative power over the citadel, is this warehouse. Inside we've got long and narrow units, just like in the citadel, and they also are connected with one another. The excavations have shown that this was a functional building. We think that there was a crawl space and a light material ground which was raised. And this warehouse must have contained perishable food or maybe grains. The palace complex, thanks to the magnetogram, seemed to have been made of 2 parts. We only interpreted it as a temple because of its size and its location, facing the warehouse and the citadel, but we haven't excavated all of it yet, so we cannot confirm the function. As for the Low City, it is located on the south of the main street, and it occupies a surface area which is more or less the same of the Upper City, 2.5 hectares. We've got an orthonormal network of streets, which was adapted as well to the topographic surface of the site. Means that there was a pre-existing plan and a quick construction of the city. The probing we carried out in this area showed us that many things were not well preserved. We haven't finished the excavation yet. Only one building was identified. It is different from the other structures of the low cities. It's 9 meters by 15 meters. And we have found a terrace as well, but we couldn't understand the function of this building. This urban area was surrounded by another kind of fortification which was more or less preserved, and it was excavated especially on the south facade. It was a 1 to 3 meter wide wall. There were several access doors or gates, and we have identified at least 2 of them, and we find here a modern tract up to the top of the site, and we can still use the traces of a former gate. We have uncovered different things next to the southwest door. We found different architectural phases. We had rectangular redans and then semi-rectangular redans, but most of them are badly preserved. And the rampart also allowed us to see some millstone and pestles, red traces, and we understand that the curtain wall of the citadel was coated with red material, and we recognized the back facade of the surrounding wall, and there was a construction against that wall. There was a buttressed vault and also a half vault which was still there and was the support for a staircase up to the parapet walk. This is where the staircase is, and you can guess the parapet walk. Now, to conclude, and this is a 3D reproduction of this urban area as a whole. It comes from a very short video which shows this city from different angles, and I'd like to show it to you very quickly. Gray is the surrounding wall, red streets, and yellow the low city buildings. That's it. And please wait. This is an aerial view of the side. Overlook d'Épée. And you have a picture of all the Overlook d'Épée team, and would like to thank all the members of this team, because all the researchers we presented to you today owe to all of them. And if you'd like to know more about these 2 periods, 2 recent books were published this year about it. Thank you. Well, we can now answer your questions.